Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Friends and colleagues, thank you very much for joining us at this event today, Sustainable Economic Growth and the Blue Economy. My name is Hannah Grist and I'm Knowledge Exchange and Communications Manager at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, part of the University of Highlands and Islands. I lead communications for an Arctic research project called Blue Action. It's my pleasure to chair today's exciting event. So today is part of a series of network events supported by the Scottish Government and entitled Scotland's Role and Contribution in a Changing Arctic Environment. Previous events have led to some very interesting discussions, and today there are further events on geophysical changes in eroding coastlines and renewable energy that I would encourage you to join if you can. The purpose of this event series is to facilitate collaboration and coordination among Scottish higher education institutions and research organisations on Arctic research and encourage greater engagement with Arctic institutions. So this event will hopefully achieve this by our 4 excellent speakers sharing their research in short presentations. This will be followed by an open discussion among everyone about how we might advance Scotland Arctic research. I do encourage you to participate fully in the discussions. Everything here is being recorded and will inform follow-up action through a report on Scottish expertise, recommendations for future Arctic research, and part of establishing a Scotland-wide Arctic research network. Now, I'm sure you're all too familiar with Zoom etiquette these days, but I just wanted to highlight that videos and cameras will be off automatically until the discussion when they will be enabled. So there'll be plenty of time for everyone to participate in the discussion session. So we're here today to discuss sustainable economic growth and blue economy. So no small task in 90 minutes. Of course, sustainability is at the heart of many of the conversations we're having today about the kind of country we want to be and the kind of world we want to leave. There are many different models of how that can relate to economic management, but fundamentally we're recognising that any economic development cannot come at the cost of the people and the environment. Now, how we manage to create a just, economically resilient society that works for people, whilst also managing the transition to net zero, is a very complex question that our speakers may take small steps towards addressing today with their talks. So some of the answers for me come from how we recognise and account for environmental benefits and capital. So I was delighted to see the concept of blue economy given prominence within this session. As a representative of Scottish Association for Marine Science, we've been working for over a century on the importance and relevance of the marine environment for our economy and society. And in this time, we've seen the shift from marine environment as a resource to be exploited to a more holistic understanding of the ocean as a wider ecosystem. And the idea of the blue economy is to bring our sustainable use of the ocean into alignment with the corresponding and equally important needs of human well-being and environmental protection. And what's increasingly coming to the fore is the idea that we need to recognise and ideally capture the more intangible resources of our environment, particularly the marine environment, such as carbon sequestration and flood protection. An attempt to value the worldwide ocean economy was set at about $1.5 trillion per year, but that value is almost certainly an underestimate and could double in the next decade. Now, as an island, Scotland's always had a really strong maritime history and relationship with our surrounding seas. And in recognition of this, the Scottish Government committed to developing a new Blue Economy Action Plan, aiming to strengthen the resilience of our marine industries and communities. And we look forward to seeing how the evidence base from our Scottish research institutions can feed into this concept. Now, more broadly, the Government strategy highlights 4 key priorities for supporting sustainable economic growth in Scotland, whether that's blue or green. And these include fostering a culture of innovation and research and promoting Scotland's international influence and networks, both of which, of course, are incredibly relevant to our topic today. Today, we're looking to focus on Scotland's relationship with the Arctic and how we can share knowledge and experience around the economy, particularly the blue economy. So, as an academic, I welcome the turn to face the Arctic from Scotland and the efforts to build on our shared history and geography. From the creation of the University of the Arctic to the new Scottish Arctic strategy, these initiatives support the growth and development of our research and collaborations. And of course, Scotland is facing many similar challenges to nations in the Arctic, particularly in relation to the economy. These can include inclusion of rural communities in just and sustainable development, cultural and economic resilience in the face of a changing world, and challenges and opportunities relating to ocean travel, extraction, fishing and tourism. As such, we see huge benefits in strengthening our links with our Arctic neighbours, benefits to research, to the environment and society across all our nations. So I think it's particularly indicative of the scope and diversity of the expertise focusing on these areas that our speakers today range in fields of specialism across economics, social science, policy and law. And I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So without further ado, I would like to bring on our first speaker today. Now, Francesco Sindico is the co-director of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, and he has been leading work on islands and COVID-19 in particular for the past year in collaboration with the Island Innovation and Institute of Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada. And together with them, he's leading the COVID-19 Island Insight series, which is mapping efforts to come out of the pandemic in a more resilient, sustainable way from 24 islands around the world, some from the Arctic and global north. So I'd like to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. I will start sharing my slides and start my 8 minutes. Can you hear me well?
Perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation. And without further ado, let me say that I'm delighted to be part of a conversation on the Arctic. Within the center, the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, of which I am the founder and director, there are plenty of colleagues who work on sustainable economic growth and the blue economy. And there are some of us that have touched upon the Arctic or have worked on the Arctic. So in the discussion and in the chat, once I finish the presentation, I will put some links. I will be happy to discuss with more people, also the work of other colleagues at the center. But today, what I want to do is the following goal. I want to actually think about the research that contributes to sustainable economic growth. I want to think of what kind of research or work that actually is, and what makes economic growth sustainable. And I know those are two huge questions, but I'll try to explore them through the two areas of work that I want to highlight in the next 6.5 minutes. The first one, as Hannah said, is our work on islands and COVID-19. And the other one, if we have time, is about sustainable education. But let's start with the first one, islands and COVID-19. We have been working on this for a year with the partners that Hannah mentioned. It started really reacting to the emergency, to the COVID crisis emergency, but now we're very much moving to reflecting on a post-COVID-19 world and trying to figure out how can that world be more sustainable and more resilient. And I don't like seeing COVID-19 as a silver lining. There's no silver lining, but it has obliged us to stop and think. So it is a learning platform and an opportunity to reflect. And it is with this in mind that we have created the COVID-19 Island Insight series with University of Prince Edward Island and with Island Innovation. And we have gotten in touch with colleagues and partners from 24 islands around the world. And we have asked them 3 things mainly. The first one was to give us a snapshot of how COVID was happening in their island. We then asked them which were the socio-economic sectors that were hit the hardest or were proven to be more resilient. And the last thing was to really try to understand how those islands were coming out of COVID in terms of recovery plans and whether one could consider those recovery plans to be more resilient or to traject a path towards more resilience and more sustainability. These are the islands that we are covering. A lot of them have already been published as insights. And you can see there's a different, we have tried to bring both island states, so islands who are sovereign and who have their own government, obviously their own parliament and everything, but also subnational island jurisdictions. Some of them have a lot of autonomy, like the Åland Islands, others much less, like Fernando de Noronha in Brazil. From an Arctic and global north perspective, we have focused on Iceland, we have Shetland Islands here in Scotland, but also Åland Islands in Finland, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island in Canada as representative, if you want, of the global north. But really, you can find islands from all over the world. Now, the overall goal is to work with them. I'll explain a little bit later what I mean by that. in order to arrive to some thematic briefs, some policy recommendations on a number of issues. Now, I have highlighted the 5 that you see there, but these are not set in stone. We will co-produce and co-decide with them which ones to focus on. But it is quite likely that things like tourism or the blue economy will definitely come out. Now, it is based to some extent on research, but as I will say, it has a very policy-driven focus. Now, a few words on Shetland and Iceland, just the contribution from the COVID-19 Island Insight series. Now, Shetland has showed great resilience in terms of COVID-19. And I think it's very much due to its diversified economy, and that was able to buffer the negative effects of COVID-19. For those of you who know Shetland, a third of its economy comes from the fisheries sector, mainly aquaculture. You have big infrastructure projects like Viking Energy, onshore wind. You still have obviously the oil and gas sector and the decommissioning of oil rigs. And you have also, let's say, architecture and the development projects like the one in Lerwick, happening in Lerwick. So yes, it suffered like all of us suffered, but it was very diversified and still is a very diversified economy. And I think that, although it's not rocket science, that's really one of the things that we need to consider very carefully going out of COVID. Iceland, obviously tourism is not the only part of Iceland. It's definitely not like other islands in the COVID-19 Island Insight series, especially in the Caribbean where tourism is huge, but tourism has grown exponentially in Iceland. Now 16% of the total workforce works either directly or indirectly on tourism. And as you would imagine, tourism has been hit very, very hard from COVID-19. However, and this is something that we may discuss, obviously, it will bounce back. The question is, how will it bounce back? And the whole idea of the COVID-19 Alliance Insight series is to identify policy recommendations for economies and the sustainable economic growth to bounce back, but in a better way. So let me say a few words about the 2 key questions, and I'll leave the sustainable education for later, maybe in the discussion or in the chat. So what kind of research, what kind of work is this? So this is not just research where you have a research question, you partner with other universities, and you come up with answers that you publish in journal articles. We may well do that as well. But I personally, and I don't talk on behalf of all the center, but I in particular, I am somewhat less interested in that kind of research. And I'm more interested in policy relevant research. In this case, research that is aimed at island-related stakeholders who can make an impact. And that's not just policymakers. That may also be the community as a whole or important socioeconomic sectors of the island. And very importantly, this research and work has to be co-produced. So in this case, we're going to have a workshop in May in the Engage Week at Strathclyde with all the authors of the 24 Insights. We're going to bring and identify some policymakers from these islands that will help us co-produce these policy recommendations. And lastly, what makes economic growth sustainable? We can all have our own ideas, but the 3 I want to highlight here are the following. It needs to be a bottom-up process. And by that, I mean that public has to be involved in a meaningful way. There needs to be a meaningful public participation. I'm at 8 minutes now, but if you just give me 20 more seconds, I will finish. The second is whether or not there is a role for the UN-led Sustainable Development Goals. We all like to think that the SDGs are important, but when you actually go to these islands and ask people, their practical role is not always so clear and relevant. And I think to some extent that's also because obviously they're led by countries and they are a lot of business as usual to some extent. Last thing, very important, we can maybe discuss later. I do think that with COVID-19, it is a time for a rethink of what makes actually economic growth truly sustainable. There were other slides that I will not go into about the education, but I'll stop here and I'll put them in the chat. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Francesco. I find 8 minutes always goes so quickly, but hopefully we can pick up some of this in the discussion. I'm very interested in what you're saying about what we truly mean by sustainability beyond this buzzword that we see everywhere, and how that works in practice. And of course, I'm a communications manager, so I'm always delighted to hear about public participation and how we do a bottom-up approach. So I look forward to picking this up a little bit later. But for now, I'd like to pass over to David Watts, who is a social scientist and historian, and based in the Rowett Institute in Aberdeen since early 2018. He leads government-funded research into food insecurity in Scotland, alternative food networks, and the relationship between eating practices and socio-economic context. So very much look forward to David's talk just now.
Morning, Hannah, and morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me along today. I'm sharing my screen, so bear with me just a moment. Let's try this one. Right, so hopefully you can all see my screen. Is that right, Hannah? You can.
Yep, that's it. I can see that.
Great. So forgive the rather ponderous title, but this work that I did last year stems from my engagement with the Scottish Environment, Food and Agricultural Research Institutes. And what they were interested in was trying to build on Scotland's new policy focus looking towards the Arctic. So I've just pulled out a few of the phrases there that struck me when I was thinking about constructing these slides. So there's a particular interest in working together with Arctic partners on the part of the Scottish Government in community regeneration in rural areas and islands, and sustainable economic development. And I was very interested to hear what Francesco was saying just a few moments ago, and I'll come on to reflect on bottom-up development a little bit later in the talk. There was a very interesting piece of research, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, from Glasgow Cali University in 2019, which started to look at where the links between Scotland and the Arctic can be found, and in particular energy, fishing and tourism. And those were where the most important economic links were, but particularly in fishing and aquaculture especially, of course, there's a lot of inward investment into Scotland from Arctic region countries, particularly Norway. So the brief I was given for this piece of CIFARI research was to really think about the Highlands and Islands in particular as a food producing region, and to reflect on how sustainable economic development could be generated, particularly through clusters of innovative food and drink enterprises. So those were the kind of key words I was using. And this relates very strongly to work that's being led by Professor David Natcher at Saskatchewan and other colleagues throughout the Arctic region on an Arctic food innovation cluster. Now, that's work that David started off by looking at the Arctic as a food producing region. So you can see the links between that and the work I was asked to do. And what they found was, in their work on Canada, Norway and Iceland, was that again the blue economy, fish, crustaceans, seals were very important aquatic fauna, but also that there was a certain amount of livestock farming, hunting, dairy and horticultural production. So they could see there was a basis there, a certain amount of food being produced. And the idea they had was to create a collaborative network to create opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation in the food and drink industry and supply chain. So I did a similar desk-based exercise for Scotland, in particular for the local authorities of the Highlands and Islands. And if you're thinking about economic clusters, of course, you're thinking about different types of enterprise that are co-located and that are related through untraded and traded interdependencies. And as a start for that, I just started looking at where there were concentrations of economic activity. And I think, again, as Francesco was saying, you can see Shetland figures strongly on this table about concentration in the blue economy. You can see a large amount of concentration of economic activity that's persisted over the last 10, 12 years. And just in case anyone's not familiar with the location quotient, it's a simple measure of concentration. So I looked at the activities in the fishing industry assumed that they were all spread equally throughout Scotland. If they were, the local authority would have a location quotient of 1.0. A location quotient of greater than 1 means there's an economic concentration of that activity in the area concerned. So you can see with some of these numbers that they're quite large, 5, and in the case of Shetland with fishing, 22.68. So as Francesco said, the Shetland economy is very strongly geared towards fishing. The other major set of inter-industry or concentrations I found were really in alcohol production. There's a lot of farming, of course, the terrestrial farming activity, but the spatial concentrations aren't particularly strong, but there are here, and this would be no surprise, of course, Scotch whisky being famed the world over. And what this started me thinking was, well, to what extent can we really talk about clustering as a mode of economic development in what are, in the Scottish case, in the Highlands and Islands, and for many Arctic regions, economically peripheral areas? Because if you look at the European Cluster Organization's definition, you can see there Naumanen's definition: groups of firms, related economic activities, actors and institutions located near each other with a sufficient scale to develop specialized expertise. And that's an interesting definition of clusters. But even for those economic activities in the Highlands and Islands that could be argued to be clustered, actually the main economic players are located elsewhere. Obviously, for the Scotch whisky industry, it's large international companies, Diageo, Pernod Ricard, Hennessy. They are the main distillery owners. So most of the high value added headquarter type functions take place outside of Scotland for this very important industry in the Highlands and Islands. And similarly, again, in aquaculture, as I've already mentioned, Norwegian companies own a great deal of aquaculture. So there's an argument about to the extent to which these concentrated industries can really count as clusters. And I think that really brings me towards a comment made a few years ago about Jahayan and Molainen, that clustering isn't really a panacea for local areas because of their thin institutional structures, narrow business networks, and limited local embeddedness of many of the economic actors, which we can see in Scotland and in many other remote areas. So I started thinking about how we can start to use innovation and clustering in a slightly different way. And here I'm drawing very much on the work of David Natcher and his colleagues. And they did a very interesting preparedness to pay study where they looked at the branding of food from the Arctic region, and they found that there was indeed a demand and a willingness to pay a premium for food produced and branded as being from the Arctic region. So this is a kind of, it's not high-tech innovation, but it is an innovation in branding, if you like. And the EU's been running protected name schemes for quite a number of years now, and it does show that they create a market premium. And when you look at, for example, the Highlands and Islands of Scotland in that graph on the right there, you'll see, and these are figures from 2020, you'll see that for the Highlands and Islands area, which is the tallest bar, if you do it on a per capita basis, the Highlands and Islands has quite a large number of protected name schemes. So they've been embraced in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland as a means of trying to secure a market premium. So it may be that there's room for that kind of development to go further in new types of innovation. I think that might, it's slightly trickier to do with the blue economy perhaps, but I think there's definitely something worth investigating there. The second point I wanted to make, and this really drew on this excellent report on food innovation in Canada's North that came out last year, I think it was. What they were suggesting was that we need to think more broadly, not just in terms of clustering, but in terms of what types of enterprise we use. I mean, orthodox clustering policy tends to look at kind of high growth, high innovation enterprises. And what they're saying is really that in northern regions, this might not be quite appropriate. And we need to widen the focus to consider other people who have similar challenges, often logistical, of course, but also that really lever in social as opposed to simply commercial enterprises. And that's something I found very interesting and useful to think with. But it also called to mind a cautionary note from work I'd done on a Northern Periphery project, Sustainable Hunting Tourism. So I appreciate this is moving slightly away from food, but it's still very much in the economic development arena. This was a Finland, Sweden, Iceland and Scotland based study, and what it was interested in was trying to increase the commercial hunting potential for these areas. And one part of this, which I'll talk about very briefly, is they were just trying to think of how stakeholders would react, stakeholders in those areas would react to a potential increase in commercial hunting tourism. And we drew together the Finnish and the Scottish experiences because the Finns had really, at that time, done very little to commercialise their hunting, whereas Scotland had done rather more. And what we found was that in both countries there were kind of dominant local hunting cultures, and that these exerted what Hayter and Barnes have called frictional resistance to the potential expansion of commercial hunting tourism. So there's a slight cautionary note here to the potential for bottom-up and socially led development, I think. I'm not trying to suggest that it's not worthwhile. It is, of course, but what we find is if there isn't sufficient local buy-in, there can be tremendous frictional resistance to new kinds of economic activity, which policymakers may want to try and introduce to make them more sustainable. And I think that's probably used up my time and possibly a little bit more, so I'll hand you back to Hannah.
Thank you, David. I feel like you just finished at an exciting moment there. I'm particularly not sure you should be allowed to discuss depth of flavour or indeed alcohol production before lunch, but thank you very much for your talk. It was certainly interesting. I'm really excited by this idea of rethinking clusters, particularly this, you mentioned the idea of main economic players being located elsewhere. I think it's a conversation that's being had over rural regions, particularly about where the value is coming from and where the benefits are felt. So look forward to exploring that a bit further in the discussion. So thank you very much. We're now going to move on quickly to our next speaker, which is Heidi Vernon, who is a Senior Knowledge Exchange and Research Fellow at the EPRC. So since joining in 2006, Heidi has specialised in comparative research on regional and local development and regional policy across Europe. Her research has a particular focus on the Nordic countries and wider Arctic, and she's particularly interested in territorial cooperation and development issues in the more peripheral and sparsely populated areas of Northern Europe and Arctic neighbourhoods. So look forward to hearing your talk, Heidi. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Hopefully you can see the full
That's working fine, yeah.
Now. Is that the case?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, well, I'm delighted to take part in the series of network events on Scotland Arctic research. Really anything that's got to do with Nordic or Arctic countries. A certain presentation is probably somewhat different in that it's quite generic, touching upon just more generally the type of research that we carry out in our research centre. It's not just me, but there are a number of colleagues behind this research as well. And I'll also kind of touch upon briefly on the kind of different partnerships we have in the Arctic and the Nordic area, especially with the kind of government authorities and academic institutions. But just before I start, I'll just very, very briefly tell you a little bit about our research centre, so that hopefully just gives you a better understanding of the type of work that we tend to engage in. Let me just move on the slides. So I'm obviously at the European Policies Research Centre, or EPRC, Government and Public Policy at the Strathclyde University. So as the kind of name suggests, our day-to-day work is very much concerned on research. We specialise in comparative research on public policy with a particular focus on kind of regional and local development policies. Now, this is quite a broad area and cuts across a number of different themes. For example, just as Francesco was speaking, we also kind of look at and monitor the impact of COVID on local and regional economies. But we really touch upon a number of different things, from anything from governance issues to looking at climate measures at a local regional level, or demographic developments, or citizens engagement, or anything really that's got like a territorial focus. Now, our comparative research covers around 35 countries if we look at a kind of wider Euro-Arctic area. And our research programs have a kind of strong emphasis on applied research and knowledge exchange. We also have a very kind of a wide linguistic expertise, which allows us to kind of engage with partners across this quite a wide area. Moving on to the next slide. As I said, we're very active in international collaboration and networking, and have over 60 institutional partners throughout Europe. And this slide here hopefully illustrates some of the many kind of country links we have with government authorities at national and subnational levels, as well as with academic institutions in the Arctic. Unfortunately, the slide would have been too messy had I tried to kind of link it with each of the institutional partners, so therefore it's just at the kind of country level. And as I kind of understand the wider Arctic neighbourhood, many of these sort of research links have been in place for around 2 decades and continue to be very active. For example, our 2 main and indeed longest running research regional policy research programs include members from the Nordic countries, including Norway, Sweden, Finland and Denmark. Similarly, most of our research projects include collaborations with academics and policymakers in the Arctic area. And just to give you a recent example of an academic collaboration, for example, last year we collaborated together with researchers of the Arctic Centre of the University of Lapland in Finland, and we were preparing together a kind of transnational project submission, which focused on the theme of just transition to low carbon and circular society and economy in the kind of European peripheral regions. And although we specialize in research, we have also teaching links. Again, just to give you a kind of a recent example, we're currently in touch with the University Centre of Westfjords in Iceland concerning the delivery of courses on regional policy. And although we've sort of had years of involvement in research projects in the Nordic countries in particular, the Arctic dimension has become a sort of more visible and prominent aspect of our research, following our hosting of a major international conference called the Arctic Connections, which took place in Glasgow back in 2014. And this conference sort of focused very much on regional cooperation networks in and around Arctic, and brought together policymakers, academics, including a number of University of Arctic member institutions, and practitioners of territorial cooperation in the Arctic region. And really since this conference, EPRS has been involved in various work related specifically to the kind of Arctic dimension. Most of that work has taken part in the context of our kind of evaluation and research work that we've been carrying out for the EU's Interreg transnational programme called the Northern Periphery and the Arctic Programme. And the work that we've carried out for this programme has very much focused on the kind of themes and issues that are of particular relevance to the kind of people living in the Arctic, the people on the ground, including indigenous populations. And we're also increasingly involved in building the kind of wider in the Scottish Government's Arctic Steering Group, and developing the Arctic Policy Framework for Scotland. And this contribution was really hugely beneficial to us, as it kind of allowed us to widen our contacts and pave the way for kind of future collaborations with Scottish actors interested in the North and Arctic. Now, looking just really briefly into the future, we're first of all very excited that Strathclyde University has decided to apply to become a member of the University of the Arctic. And for us, strengthening and widening many of the already existing links, but also kind of creating new connections. Our angle, obviously, I'm very aware that our angle to the kind of Arctic research is very much broader than is the case with many of our colleagues here today. Regional local development is obviously a very broad area, but the kind of work that we do allows us to kind of see the various interrelationships and across the different sectors and kind of pull these various strands together and provide a kind of holistic picture of the development issues. And we are particularly keen to kind of look at the territorial development issues in the wider Arctic neighbourhood, which also includes countries such as Arctic neighbours such as Scotland. And one particular area of interest concerns the development issues on the ground, the kind of capacity issues that the local people and the communities, especially in the kind of more peripheral and sparsely populated areas, face. And this could be, for example, in terms of understanding many of the kind of higher level strategies and things like that. So this was a very, very generic presentation, but just to kind of conclude, we are indeed very interested in teaming up more closely with colleagues across Scotland concerning Arctic Nordic research, and myself and indeed a wider number of colleagues at EPRC are indeed available for any follow-up discussions, and my contact details are on this final slide. That's for my part, and I look forward to taking part in the discussions. If I just stop sharing, and I'll pass over to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for that overview. I certainly learned a lot about what it is you do there, which is fantastic. And it's great to see, of course, the breadth of links with the Arctic institutions, from your conferences to research programs, and particularly looking to join the University of the Arctic, which is obviously an exciting initiative. So I hope you make some collaborations from this session today. I look forward to hearing more. Thank you. I'm now going to pass over to our final speaker for today. So Brooks Kaiser is a professor at the University of Southern Denmark, and her specializations environmental and resource economics and economic history. Her long-run research agenda investigates connections between economic and ecological transformations of natural capital over the short, long, and very long runs. Current examples include marine invasive species in Arctic waters and transformations of socio-ecological systems in Hawaiian Arctic communities. That is quite a set of research interests, so I look forward very much to hearing from Brooks just now.
Hopefully my screen is now shared.
We can see you fine, yeah.
Okay, yes, I have a lot of interests that all boil down to sort of how humans use resources and how those are connected in a resource economic framework. And in the Arctic, one of the reasons I enjoy working and thinking in the Arctic is much like what I did for the first part of my career in Hawaiian Islands. You can see the ecology and the economy laid out pretty well with a little bit of investment of your time and effort. So I moved to Denmark in 2011, at which point a research agenda on Hawaii seemed a bit far. And so it was time to shift gears and come to the Arctic. So 5 years after getting here, I was able to make this sort of roadmap of what the marine Arctic sort of industrial pillars are of fishing and shipping and tourism and oil and gas, as you have heard today, talked about in pieces. And then think about how they fit together and who the decision makers and people who are impacted by those resources are, how they interact as a system, and how the ecology of the marine mammals and fisheries interact within them. And we'll talk about where we are 5 years from that in a second, but these pillars, lots of people are studying the natural science of them, lots of people are studying them in isolation. I'm really interested in how they connect and how they interact and how they can create conflicts that economics can help solve. And part of that for my research group has been developing networks that are not just academic, but they include resource managers, industry participants, the communities, and the policy world. In the Arctic, one thing to keep in mind is that the policy science interface is probably closer than in just about any other system that I've looked at, and that's partly because of the way the Arctic Council itself functions through these 6 working groups of social and human welfare, pollution, or ACAP, AMAP, all the abbreviations that you will hear or have heard. The ones we have been most active with are the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment, or PAME, and CAF, which is the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna. And those have been natural connectors to the scientists who've been working on maybe a sub-problem that we want to think about in the big picture. And I cannot say enough about the 7th pillar of the Arctic Council, which is really University of the Arctic, or UArctic, in terms of helping to facilitate that. So I have come to the Arctic through the lens of invasive species. These are systems disruptors. And in the Arctic, in the Barents Sea, we have these 2 crab species that are new to the area, that have become part of the fabric of the Barents landscape in very complex ways. So there are fishing questions involved, how they interact with cod, how they need new infrastructure, and there are becoming tourism questions involved. The red king crab is a new delicacy on the tourism front. You have people coming to the Barents now to go on king crab safaris, for example. And so these 2 seemingly disparate stories are pretty deeply intertwined. And the UArctic already had a thematic network on northern tourism. And we were able to join that and tap into a wide variety of knowledge and experience there. But what we were seeing with the crabs is that they are such a miraculous harbinger of the disruptions that we expect to come as climate change warms waters, changes species activities or locations, moves things around, moves business, moves ecology around. That was Pan-Arctic, because now that the Barents have them, most waters in the Arctic have these crabs to some extent or another, and also connects north-south because the main markets are Asian. And so we built our own UArctic network called Global Ecological and Economic Connections in Arctic and Subarctic Crab Markets, pulled together members from the producing countries and the main consuming countries of these crabs to look at sort of any types of questions that this brings up. We were able to do that with a variety of exploratory network funds through UArctic itself, Danish Ministry for Higher Education and Science. My understanding is UArctic is doing something with Scotland like this. Nordic Council of Ministers, and so partnering with Nordic partners is access to that. And sort of able to then put those into bigger applications for research grants from Belmont Forum and Nordregio and the Norwegian Research Council. So the network development has been part of the research development. And it isn't just about having meetings. Could be that you end up with a group of people who has a small research question, or seemingly small in this big picture thing, like how does oil and gas seismic survey noise impact marine mammals and the humans who value them? That smaller research question can instantly sort of pull from these various networks to get some answers in a new fashion. We've done some work on that. That shipping pillar, we also have an internal University of Southern Denmark Blue SDU group pulling across all of our faculties that we've been able to use to see what really the interdisciplinary challenges are. And with that, we sort of were able to identify ports as these cross-purpose community infrastructures or failures in that cross-purpose community infrastructure, and look at the role of community agency and how those roles are going to change as maritime transport becomes even more important in most of the Arctic as time continues. There aren't very many deep water Arctic ports. This is a place where communities are talking about a lot of investment and how to do that in ways that, as the other groups were talking about, keeps the value at home and enhances it, I think is really important how these conversations go forward. And then finally, through this, what are we gaining with this network and these researchers? Being able to think about community well-being in this multidimensional framework with trade-offs and understanding in new ways how ways of knowing contribute to things like ocean monitoring, resource use, definitions of abundance, and building these sustainable development pathways by asking sort of for whom and for what. What we have managed to produce, because we're academics and we need to, produce some outputs, have been in this social science framework, but have included not just journal articles, which we do have in either on their own or in special issues, but also interdisciplinary books where the Arctic is the framework, multidisciplinary outlets. CRAB, we just published in Marine Policy with 19 co-authors on this CRAB network story. Official reports to some of these agencies like AMAP or ICES. Smaller groups in focused disciplinary and interdisciplinary outlets. And then these Arctic Council working groups tend to have Arctic conferences where the science policy interface is very tight, and so you have an immediate pathway into discussing the policy implications of your work and the questions that still need to be answered. And building in also the outreach through UArctic, through Polar Research and Policy Initiative, Twitter, we have a blog, videos, to tell these system stories and bring the sort of Arctic questions to the bigger global perspective that they touch upon. How do I stop sharing?
Thank you, Brooks. Are you sorted?
Yeah, I'm trying to stop the sharing.
Okay, no problem.
Oh, there we go.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. That was incredibly interesting. I'm particularly interested to hear this example of king crab safaris. Something beyond a simple.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about this a bit more. I think maybe David might have an opinion on this during the discussion, and we could bring you two together. But overall, I think that's an incredible look at our whole systems approach, which actually is a great final talk to take us into discussion.